With that said, let's move on to session 3 on case studies. We're going to kick off with Michael Greenberg, then we'll move on to Tom Cullen, and then we'll wrap it up with a duo, Steve Diggins and Lena Collins, all of whom are going to be facilitated by Jennifer Flint, who is the communications manager at Oregon's DEQ. So I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer to then go introduce the rest of our speakers. So I'll be in the background and enjoying the show. Thank you. Is Jennifer on the line? Just checking. If not, we'll just get started right away with Mike. Mike, I see you there. Why don't you pop on your slides and we'll get started, and Jennifer can jump in when you're done.
I was just admitted as a participant.
Oh,
sorry for the delay.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm honored to introduce our 4 presenters for session 3, during which we will start my video and during which we'll discuss case studies and recent incidents. So please welcome Michael Greenberg. He is with Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Tom Cullen, Office of Spill Prevention and Response with California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Steve Diggin with Coastal First Nations Great Bear Initiative. And Lena Collins with Wekano Nation. Hope I've done you justice in my pronunciations there, and look forward to hearing from you all.
Let me try to share my screen here. There we go. So as I said, I'm Mike Greenberg. I'm a state on-scene coordinator for the Oregon DEQ. This is actually mostly a Coast Guard project. We did have participation in this, but I have a long history with the vessel, and they're undergoing a lot of vacation and other burdens right now that they didn't feel that they could spare the time to do this presentation. Most of the pictures here are taken by the Coast Guard as well, and there's a few that I took over the years. In any case, am I supposed to be able to hit the arrow button and jump to the next one? It's not doing it. Can somebody help me on
Okay, are you able to see the arrows in the lower left or in your, do you have it full screen? Why don't you exit full screen perhaps? I'll let Caleb step in and see if he can troubleshoot.
Okay. Okay, I see the arrow. I see the little arrows. So as I said, the real heroes on this project were, U.S. Coast Guard and their contractor Ballard Marine Construction. The Tiffany was built in 1939 in Galveston, Texas, as a Coast Guard buoy tender. You can see in the 60s it was sold to a private party and converted to a fishing vessel. And later on, the owner, he changed it to fry oil. He's been using it to scrap derelict vessels during all this time. I first encountered the vessel in 2011. The owner has typically avoided contact with any governmental agencies. We believe that at this point he's probably deceased. And it's been a problem for both Washington Ecology and DEQ and the Coast Guard. That's the picture of it in 2011. I took that when I was out visiting the LST 1166, another ADV that's in our river. And we suspected that he was scrapping that, taking scrap off that vessel as well. We're pretty positive he was. And it's really interesting, the 2 cases here, because they both have so many similarities. Heavy metals and PCBs in the oil, in the paint, and both have lots of oil and other hazmat as well. So in 2012, Ecology and U.S. Coast Guard responded to the vessel again. Took off 1,700 gallons of fuel oil and water, helped patch up the hull to keep it afloat so it wouldn't sink. In the process, I believe there was a criminal case that came out of this. I have no idea whatever came of that, because they typically don't inform me about actual criminal cases and where they go unless I follow them closely. and then only like a year plus after the fact. But I do believe that Coast Guard and US EPA's criminal division did attempt an enforcement case on the owner. So in 2021, we discovered it was sunk. And as you can see, there's a pretty good sheen coming off there. Lots of solid waste, household hazardous waste. And usually with these older vessels too, you're encountering the things I mentioned before, heavy metals, PCBs, asbestos. So initially the vessel was too difficult to access with divers. There's lots of junk on board, it's shifting. I couldn't access all the spaces. So eventually we brought in a crane to raise the vessel, and it has since been patched and had all the pollution removed. As you can see, we recommend to get some samples taken. So it was, a lot of parties engaged in this, from Columbia County Sheriff to the SHPO, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, and Oregon State Lands obviously has a role, and EPA was helping to look into some other disposal options for us. So here's the second week, and they've got the vessel raised now, and you can see that they're finally getting access to these areas and trying to clean it out. You can also see that there is oil on everything's contaminated. So again, large amounts of hazmat. Ended up being, we took out 6,300 gallons of oily water off the vessel. Numerous pinhole leaks were found in it, so they had to patch it again in order to keep it from resinking. This is the analytical results on the paint sample we took from the vessel. This may not mean a lot to many of you, but 3,300 parts per million lead is very high, as is that, you see that Aerochlor 1254 PCB count. PCBs cause a problem in a biological environment in the parts per billion range. So, we're 4 orders of magnitude. This is a heavily contaminated vessel, and that's, the paint.
Mike, we have about 3 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
So
well, here we are.
not a big rush.
Here we are staged. All the materials that got removed off there. Washington provided a lot of assistance. Coast Guard and we are not able to scrap derelict vessels except under unusual circumstances. And typically what they do is go on them and they remove the hazmat and the oil, and then we leave them alone. And whether that's sinking in place or, and there again, you see the count on all the things we removed. And we all roughly have the same authorities as spill response funding, but we can only deal with the pollution aspect. We don't have a fund. Oregon Marine Board has 150 per biennium. Sometimes State Lands takes the lead. They only get about 35,000 per biennium. And RiverCast on this vessel alone were greater than 1 million. And here's just a brief history of some other vessels. We had the Tiffany. LSC 1166 was 10 to 14 million. We calculated we probably could have scrapped that vessel for 5 million if they were allowed to do that, if Coast Guard was allowed to take action. And of course, Davy Crockett was scrapped in place in the river a long time ago. And there's just some estimated costs on various sizes of vessels. So you can see our funding doesn't even begin to match, the problem. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was great. And we will allow for questions at the end. Feel free to put some questions in the chat feature, and we can get to those as well, most definitely. And so now we will hear from Tom Collin again, and he's with Office of Spill Prevention and Response, California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Go ahead, Tom.
Hi, thanks. And Mike, I apologize. I think my comments about sending off Sarah probably cut into your time and rushed you, but I'll try to go very quickly and give some more time at the end for you. So folks, I mentioned how 2 of the responses here in California took up probably 80% of my time this past year. So I'm going to fly through a bunch of slides with some pictures and then offer some observations at the end. So let's start out with trying to advance the slide. American Challenger, a 90-foot steel Western rig trawler that had been out of service for probably about 10 years. and the owner with his own tugboat decided to take this thing to scrap down in Mexico out of Puget Sound and transit down the coast, sell it, and then take the tugboat itself, continue on and sell it to somebody in Panama for whatever use they were going to do. So they submitted a dead ship tow plan with the Coast Guard up in Puget Sound. They got down the coast somewhere up around Oregon. That towing hawser failed, and so they put a braided nylon line over to it. Got down a beam, Point Reyes National Seashore here in California. That line fouled around the tug's starboard screw, parted, disabled the tugboat. They call Mayday. One thing leads to another. The American Challenger washes up just south of Bodega Bay in the waters and seabed of Marin County and the Gulf of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. So here's a map that kind of shows where it is, the big red dot there. Here it is, high and dry. Here's the dot with respect to the sanctuary. And you can see with the coastline and the cliffs that there was no real easy way or safe way, given the not only the surf, but the sneaker waves that can come up, of boarding it from the rock. So all operations getting on the boat and assessing it had to be done by helicopter, meaning cost. The vessel with the best schematics that they could come up with had 17 tanks. The incomplete, vague dead ship tow plan didn't really specify how much there was. They had estimates. It was inconclusive. There were 4 tanks that could not be accessed for the first several months of the response. Finally, they did. We spoke about Ballard. Mike mentioned them. That was the initial Coast Guard contractor. They got on board, took imagery videos, and it was clear that there was a lot of oil still on there, freely expressing with the breached hull, other, what would they call household waste, non-oil, batteries, flares, other things that were on there. Some more images you could see in the right-hand picture, the cliff. And by the way, the landowner of that cliff is the founder of Lagunitas Brewing. And so he had a big interest in trying to get that thing out of there pretty quickly. Here's a picture I took, kind of a panorama. You could see the American Challenger down in the right-hand side of this shot. And that's Point Reyes National Seashore on the other side of the picture. And by the way, that leads into Tamales Bay, which is where the San Andreas Fault goes from landside into the ocean, creates this bay. And there's a very rich oyster fishery that's located about 4 miles or so south in the bay there that we had to initially protect with boom. There was very light sheening from the ship. It still has some sheening, making its way out, but nothing that's going to, get all the way down there to the oyster beds. And this is a screenshot I took actually this morning. We have a camera that's monitoring it right now. Talk about leveraging technology. We're looking to try to see if we can see any more sheening. Of course, seeing if there's any more of a change in the vessel's orientation, its adjustment. Where it stands now, we have a unified command of Coast Guard as Federal On-Scene Coordinator, OSPR, my office as State On-Scene Coordinator, Gulf of the Farallones Marine Sanctuary, County of Marin. We have a responsible party, but he doesn't have insurance. He's nowhere to be found. What we're waiting for now is this is not going to be able to be pulled off, put on a barge, removed. It's going to have to be destroyed in order to, get it off the rocks, remove the oil safely. And in order for a vessel to be destroyed, and maybe some of my Coast Guard colleagues, I should know this because I'm a former Coast Guard guy, whether it's U.S. flag or in U.S. waters or both, it requires the approval of the Commandant of the Coast Guard, and that can't be delegated. So there's a package in routing fully endorsed by the local Coast Guard, the FOSC, that's awaiting to reach Admiral Schultz that he can give the approval. But it's going to be a long process. And we expect that it won't really begin in earnest until the spring, going through the heavy weather. And we've been trying to get on board to further winterize it, close it up, tighten it up, reassess it. So that's American Challenger. I'll have some comments at the end. Pipeline 00547, October 3rd. How could I forget? So I'm sitting having my Saturday morning coffee, and I get a call, from my chief warden. Hey, something's going on down. There's some reports of, oil off Huntington Beach. And I pull up this app, which is called Flight Radar. I use this to look at airplanes. And I say, wow, there's 6 helicopters all flying offshore. What are they doing? Oh, it's Orange County Fire. Uh-oh. And you can see how they're all circling around. And I said, something's up. Then I go to marine traffic, and here you can see all the green dots are the various container ships and some tankers that are waiting to go into Los Angeles, Long Beach. But I'm seeing all these pink vessels. What are they doing? Well, sure enough, there's this air show going on. Blue Angels, Thunderbirds, and the oil is just down there, kind of where you see the blue dots at the bottom are the platforms, and that the leak is kind of where that little is. And so these are the first images I got that morning from actually one of our boats that was out there to enforce the beginning of the lobster fishery that we had to immediately close. And looking at these pictures, said, that's pretty thick stuff. And you can see the platforms in the background. So what it was is let me think, 16-inch steel concrete encased pipeline that feeds from this platform Ellie, the closest one at the bottom, with other platforms feeding into it, central point. Then it travels down this 17.5-mile pipeline that's resting on the seabed about 120 feet down, turns, comes ashore. Well, it actually goes underground and underground ashore by the Queen Mary up there at the pump station. And they put ROVs down there, some divers, and they found that the pipe had been displaced about 105 feet. There's a couple big trenches that look just like anchor fluke marks that looks like it pulled it and put a crack in the pipe in federal waters on the seabed. However, once it comes to within 3 miles of shore, it becomes a state, lease. Massive early response. We had pretty much all the on-water recovery done in the first 4 to 5 days, about 5,500 gallons of liquid oil recovered. And here's a couple of the NSRC boats going and collecting this really thick peanut buttery consistency oil. When we flew over that second day in a Coast Guard plane, it was miles and miles and miles of sheen. Immediately got out there to protect sensitive sites with boom, and we mobilized by the end of the week 1,800 personnel. I'll have some observations, toward the end on some other comments. Most of those people got out in the form of these SCAT teams, the Shoreline Cleanup Assessment Technique teams. There's about 107 segments identified in the area contingency plan between Orange County and San Diego County, 30 in Orange County, 70 down in San Diego County. And they would go out and have segment assignments each day. Each segment is about 70 miles of coastline. And here they are, some are hotshot teams responding to reports. Most are scheduled, based on trajectory mapping to go out and clean up. Here's the status that we got this morning. And I'm proud to report we have a new color in this segment, SCAT segment donut, as we call it, the white segment, for the first time as of today, that we're actually signing them off. They've achieved endpoints. They've gone through 2 levels of administrative review at the Unified Command in partnership with our local county reps down there, reassuring them that the beach has achieved background status, because this is an area that's also very heavy with, you'll see the slide later, with natural seep. Scott Lundgren's office of NOAA's response and restoration, they estimate, and these are pretty wide range, but natural seep off of California can produce between 4,200 and 25,000 gallons of oil per day. So upwards of 1.5 to 9 million gallons per year. And we don't clean that up. That's natural, that's out there. But it's mixed in now with this oil that came from the pipeline. So, laboratory testing and all that is very important. And then, cleaning up to return to that background. As I said, we had to impose a fishery closure, extended about 7.5 miles offshore. It's still in place. It takes about 14 days from taking samples of fish and studying tissue to reopen. Some of the happy stuff. This was a kind of a lull in the migratory patterns of a lot of the seabirds, and so some endangered birds were collected, snowy plovers in particular, and rehabilitated by our Oiled Wildlife Care Network, and then media events to watch them return to the public. One actually escaped. It was presented to me as bad news while I was on a call with the governor's office, but it came back. It returned to its friends to be officially released the next day. Here's a happy duck getting cleaned, the before and after, with not a commercial endorsement for Dawn detergent, but being cleaned up with a big smile on its face. Massive interest in what we call unaffiliated volunteers, folks that want to go out there and pick up oil, but need to be made aware of the hazards and then brought in an organized way. And we did so in 4 events to get them out on the beach to help clean, and oftentimes to remove debris, some of the rack that could get oil to make it more complicated to clean later. Created this graph to kind of show the massive effort early on to try to get out there and clean up as much as we can, and then how it's tailed off to this point that we're down collecting maybe 100 or so pounds a day, from its high of more than 6,000 pounds. And this is the kind of the challenge we're faced with. A lot of this rack in the tidal zone, that the oil gets in there and then it's very laborious to try to get it out. I mentioned the offshore seeps. Here's some of the major ones in California. Vessel decon, you saw all those pleasure boats that were out there. They canceled the air show. They couldn't go back out the next day, but many did get oil on them. And so we've got several that have already been cleaned, with some scheduled still to be done. Wildlife impact, as I said, was fortuitously low, minimal. The dead on arrival number of 105, any wildlife that was collected dead on the beach was, logged in here, but, not all of them. As a matter of fact, the majority of them did not show any signs of oil, but they're going through further examination as part of the investigation to see whether they were affected. And now we're moving forward with final steps. There's a civil and criminal investigation in parallel with natural resource damage assessment. And as part of that NERDA process, there's going to be work groups within these areas to look at damage and harm, and then proceed with, the negotiated settlement to do restoration. And probably my last slide before some observations. This is the interagency effort that was brought to bear on this response. It was massive. We were the benefit of some good luck, which I'll discuss, and hence my observations. How am I doing on time?
You're doing great, Tom. You have like 15 more minutes.
Oh, okay, good. So let's chat a little bit here. So I said we had some good luck. So as bad as it looked from the air that first day, miles of sheen with a lot of streaks of thick black goop on the water. And we landed, and we are, I'm with the admiral, I'm with my boss, the director, and with the head of Cal OES, the head of state parks, head of state lands. And we're thinking, oh boy, big type 1 incident. This is going to be bad. So I come home, pack a bag. I'm on a Southwest flight down the next day, landing in Long Beach. I'm looking out the window and I'm seeing lightning. Wait, a thunderstorm, California. Thank goodness for that. That storm came in and pushed a lot, or contained a lot of that oil, kept it offshore, got kind of in an eddy about 7 miles out, maybe in the lee of Catalina Island, and it bought us time. It gave us the time to get that protective boom out there on some of those sensitive sites, to mobilize, those 1,800 people and get them trained up into their groups. We had to move our unified command from a smaller office to a little bigger one, and then eventually to the Orange Coast Community College, where it really served our needs well. Huge political and public outcry about the lost use of beaches, because some were immediately closed, of course, in anticipation of a lot of oil. The loss of the lobster fishery, their biggest event of the year in that sector, and the outrage looking at another offshore oil spill. This is 30 years after the American trader right on the heels of Exxon Valdez that spilled hundreds of thousands of gallons of crude oil about 2 miles from where this one happened. The continued frustration hearing upon the evidence of an anchor being the likely cause of this, and all of those ships I just saw on the news in the noon hour that we're down to about 70 that are offshore right now, but it was as high as 100 that are just waiting to go in there, and various issues associated there. We're having problems still with sharing of information, and I'll leave it at that. But we know that we need to do a better job of crossing out of the response and working collaboratively with the two investigations, NRDA and the civil criminal investigation. You heard me say a little bit earlier when I was talking about the spill technology workshop that's going to be coming up, and the challenges, the misunderstanding from the public, the frustration that we can't do more at night. We can't do more with initial notifications. And we get lots of reports through the various reporting chains of things offshore. And a lot of times it's natural seep. Sometimes it's just simple tidal lines. We had NOAA satellites and NASA overflights, testing their experimental technologies, seeing anomalies, some dampening on the water, but it might not be oil. It might be, just a simple change in winds. So, we're going to have to really, try harder to find, better technologies to help with that. Let's see. One thing that was interesting for me to observe in this age of COVID, a comment was made yesterday that, and it's accurate, we're never going to be able to do spill response management. I say management because I'm differentiating that from on-scene active, cleanup, collection, rehabilitation, the field activities. We're never going to be able to do that entirely virtually. We need to be together in a big space using proper protective protocols, as we were in this case. But the thing that really jumped out at me was how high morale was. It was a combination of things going our way with this spill, but also being back together, and working together as a team. And it was very rewarding to see that. With this bill, one of the things I've been testifying to in the Senate and Assembly hearings is that they all want to know, what can we do better? What are the lessons learned? And we're going to go through that process. We're going to identify those things. But I pivot a bit and point back to, for California, Cosca Busan, to the Dubai Star, to the Refugio Beach oil spill in 2015, and others, and say, we've really learned a lot. We have really beefed up and become very good, I think, with our liaison outreach. We had daily interagency briefings, and then followed by briefings to electeds and their staff, giving them the first look at information before it went public. And they really appreciate that. We in California, innovatively, in the heels of Cosca Busan, now have local government on-scene coordinators. So the slide I showed you with the interagency, San Diego and Orange, very important and instrumental in working with us. We've ramped up our volunteer coordination efforts. You saw that there were 10,000 people that registered, and we would go and train them and have them help us out, making them feel valued. Tribal outreach, having them involved in the protection of their cultural and rich historical, lands. This was the first time we actually operationalized, if that's the word, a public health assessment unit to look at water and air quality and threats to the public. And then the last thing I have to say to this one is that we recognize at the executive level that, especially someplace like this with huge political pressures, that the response needs to be protected. And I am very grateful to my boss, Director Bonham, others in the executive level of state government for coming together and really taking a lot of the pressure off the response so they could do the actual work of responding, cleaning up, and we would go and be the face to a lot of them and answer their concerns and questions. So that's on the pipeline. Quickly on American Challenger, I know I'm going back in time here. So it's now, as Hillary described, the newest poster child for our abandoned derelict vessel crisis. And no matter what laws we get enacted, either at the federal or state level, this is a great example of how there's always going to be somebody that's going to fly below the radar, that's not going to comply with laws. We see that in so many other things, whether it's gun control or whatever. They're going to, you know, find loopholes, or they're going to find gaps. This guy didn't have insurance per Washington state law. He somehow got this vessel registered as a recreational vessel. Go figure. I don't know what that would mean. It doesn't mean anything for a response, but we have to be prepared for these kinds of events. I mentioned the kind of incomplete, inaccurate dead ship tow plan. We also are hoping to hear more from the Coast Guard as they look at this, and at the distress timeline. It had about 4 to 5 hours from the initial notification until that thing came aground. And what can we do in partnership to try to, better prevent these kinds of things from happening? We had a whole bunch of tugboats down south in San Francisco, and we need to take a look at what we can do better there. So I'm getting into a little bit of an uncomfortable place here, but I think I need to share. This was a very rocky response from the beginning. I don't know what's going on, but there's some sort of interagency thing going on outside of California, back in the Washington, D.C. Beltway, between US EPA and the US Coast Guard. We went through quite a storming phase to finally get the wheels back on the cart and past the storming phase into performing. And I'm very grateful to the leadership of both those agencies, particularly here with the Coast Guard 11th District, with Admiral Brian Penoyer, and with Kay Lawrence and Enrique Manzanilla at US EPA Region 9. We've had a lot of operations where we've worked together, Coast Guard normally taking the Open 90 oil side, US EPA taking the CERCLA Superfund non-oil side, and working together. And all of a sudden, in this thing, and this is my guess, this is Tom Cullen kind of reading the tea leaves. There's a tail wagging the dog back in DC saying, oh, no, you can't have both. It's one or the other because they both have the same authorities. This is capital. It slowed it down. It made for some very difficult times. We had weekly RRT-9 calls, and the RTs, they're there to look at alternate response technologies and use of dispersants and in situ burning, which didn't apply here, but now all of a sudden they're being brought in as some sort of a mediator to try to work through these things. And so I say that because I want to have my Coast Guard and EPA colleagues here know that we are standing by and we want to work better with you and try to get past these things. Maybe exercise them, talk about them before we have an actual event. That all said, it's going great now. We just are waiting for that approval from the Commandant, and we hope that we can get this thing cleaned up. We also recognize, yes.
Well, let's wrap up in a couple of minutes.
Yes, of course.
We've got some good questions for you.
I was going to make my last point. Thanks.
Please do.
Yeah, and so there, I forgot my last point.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. Well, let's hit questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and read the first one here. You mentioned that the pipeline was bowed due to vessel anchor dragging the pipeline. Are there designated anchorage locations around the pipeline, or did the vessel just anchor there? And how will they prevent this from happening in the future? And that question's from Stephanie Spencer. Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Stephanie. So the Coast Guard regulates all facets of navigation. NOAA, creates the nautical charts. This pipeline is indeed on charts. There are designated anchorages off of LA Long Beach that you saw up in the corner of that chart, but vessels are allowed to anchor. They're not necessarily designated, but the whole area is allowed to be an anchorage. And it's very closely monitored by, there's a vessel traffic service co-located with the Marine Exchange of the ports of LALB. And they noticed that several vessels were dragging back during a major event back in January. It's all under investigation, but the Coast Guard will have that as a corrective action to address, I'm sure.
Another question is from an anonymous attendee. Mr. Cullen, to what extent does pipeline free span increase vulnerability to debris, spill exposure, etc.?
I'd have to have our anonymous questioner define free span for me. And getting into the technical aspects, though, of oil infrastructure, this is a shared jurisdiction for prevention and regulation between offshore would be PHMSA with DOT, US DOT, as it comes into the state, waters, mainly state lands offshore, but also the state fire marshal. So anything technical related to pipeline characteristics or regulations, I would respectfully, defer to them.
Thanks. Jim O'Neill asks regarding the shoreline washing agents is regarding the LA pipeline incident. So he's asking, does the response require any shoreline washing agents? And if so, what was used? So my office approves oil spill cleanup agents. We call them OSCAs. And the only one that I recall giving the approval for was a vessel decon agent for cleaning. I don't remember anything being needed on the shoreline, unlike the Refugio Beach pipeline spill that had a lot of soiled rocks that needed to be scrubbed, steam cleaned, so forth. We didn't have that as much here. I think everything that came ashore was collected, weighed, and then carted off. Jim, does that answer your question? Do we have any more questions or questions for Mike Greenberg? Okay, if we haven't answered your questions, we will do so in a follow-up communication. Other than that, I think we're ready to move on. Is that correct, Sarah?
That sounds right. Thanks, Jennifer.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Tom and Mike. And now we'll hear from Steve Diggin and Elena Collins.
Thanks.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, sounds good.
Great. I think I've got this. I think you're seeing a presentation.
Yes, we can see it.
Is that correct? Okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm there. Well, good afternoon. My name's Steve Diggin. I'm the Marine Planning Manager for Coastal First Nations and Great Bear Initiative. I'm here with Lena Collins from the Wiikino Nation. She's the Marine and Shipping Projects Coordinator. We're here to share with you an example of an incident that occurred in an isolated First Nations community and talk about some of the challenges and systemic issues that they faced, all the while experiencing COVID-19. This is a presentation that does get at the First Nations emerging role in incident preparedness and response within British Columbia. We're located on the north coast of BC and work in partnership with 13 First Nation communities. We've been doing a lot of proactive marine spatial planning in this region through community-based planning initiatives and other larger initiatives like the Marine Planning Partnership or MAP, if some of you have heard about it. And we're also now working on a network of marine protected areas. Through that work and a number of marine incidents that have been occurring on the coast and in the communities, there's been a real push from the First Nation communities to build capacity and become more involved in planning, preparedness, and spill response. We're coordinating and working together as First Nation communities, and more recently in collaboration with federal and provincial governments. The red circle that you see there on the map locates where Lena is calling in from, and also where the case study is occurred. So what you can see there is the areas with all of these nations up and down the coast that are listed here as our partners. These communities have been here stewarding their landscapes for over 14,000 years. They're remote and have limited infrastructure. Recent incidents like the near wreck of the Simishir on the west coast of Haida Gwaii and the grounding and sinking of the Nathan Stewart near Bella Bella have really pronounced the disconnect between First Nations governments and industry response planning. When a spill happens, it has an enormous impact on these First Nation communities. Their food sources are threatened or potentially destroyed. It has a cascading effect, often tearing right through their social fabric. And it impacts their cultural practices, their community health, and their local economies. They're small, they're isolated, and they can't just call 911 to get assistance right away. All 13 First Nation communities that we work with are obligated by their own laws to steward their territories, and they'll do whatever they can to minimize and mitigate impacts of a spill. They're often first in the scene, and we can point to many incidents where they have saved lives and vessels. Typically, the risks they face are not their own, and they're driven by external interests, whether it's a transiting vessel or whatever. But they're left to deal with the immediate and long-term consequences. The current response system in Canada, it really doesn't acknowledge and support the interests of First Nations communities. It creates a huge imbalance of power among the polluter, the government, and the affected nations. In attempts to address some of these challenges, we have signed a reconciliation framework agreement with Canada. It is significant, but it's only a framework. BC is now being added to that framework with, I think that's a good positive thing. It creates a governance or creates a series of governance structures for First Nations, communities, Canada, and BC to collaboratively work on new approaches and create policy to change and integrate First Nations into these types of issues. It's not easy, and we're often challenged by long-held organizational cultural impediments, but we are making progress. Now I'm going to turn it over to Lena to walk you through the case study.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lena Collins. I'm the Marine and Shipping Technical Coordinator for the Mikina Nation. As Steve mentioned, I'll be presenting on the incident that occurred in our area. On February 15th, 2021, a tanker pup that held the diesel for the diesel generators for Mikina Village had torn a pipe on the lower portion of the tank and was estimated that around 7,000 to 8,000 liters spilled into the environment. We experienced an extreme weather event where the temperatures dipped down to -11 with a wind chill factor about like -18 to 21 for 3 days and caused a condensation in the pipe to freeze and expand, causing it to tear. The diesel impacted 120 meters of land and continued seepage into the water at the head of Rivers Inlet. I'd guesstimate the amount of impact on a daily basis to be around 100 to 125 liters for about 2 to 3 days before containment achieved. To determine the water impact sites, I went out with the Mikina Guardians to see if we could see any trace of the diesel. We smelled trace evidence, however, with the closing light, we were limited on time to assess. There were minimal traces on the shoreline, however. On the surface area of the water arranged in size, the largest was about 25 meters in length and 3 meters in width. We have no equipment on site, and we put a call out to the surrounding businesses. Duncan B. Lodge provided absorbent pads and absorbent boom and would provide more if required. Coast Guard was notified along with the MBC, which is Emergency Management, British Columbia. A call with the province and the federal government had been set up. On the call, I was informed by a member of Transport Canada to limit ground disbursement of diesel into the water column. We needed to cover up the area of the tarp. I, along with the Guardians, had gone and laid out the tarp. That did decrease the seepage. Chris Johnson, who is a member of the First Nations Coast Guard Auxiliary in Bella Bella, heard of the incident and pushed to get the equipment to Beacon. He arrived the following day at around 2 p.m. with his deckhand, Lewis Shaw. They were the first on scene with equipment. Chris assessed the site and explained how they approach for safety and mitigation purposes. He worked with our Guardian watchman and set out the containment boom that took around 3 hours. Later that evening, Chris talked us through the process and the purpose of what we were doing and how we were mitigating the impact on the environment and containment of the pollutant, and to consider the surrounding environmental circumstances when dealing with monitoring. The following morning, I looked at the land and water maintenance procedures. I had to come up with the best approach to limit impact to individuals and environment. That had its own challenges because of the size of the village, and burnout was a concern. Another factor that impacted was access to supplies. There was another incident down south, and the supplier had a shortage of absorbent boom. As mentioned earlier, Duncanby offered, and we reached back out to them for more supplies. And they and another resort called Good Hope delivered more supplies to site. Diana Chan from Helsik staff obtained access to Coast Guard equipment that would be delivered by the Helsik Guardians. However, due to COVID restriction, the Helsik Guardians delivered the equipment to Dawson's Landing, located 45 minutes west of the spill site. If they came into the village, they would have had to go into a 14-day quarantine. Chris and Lewis were aware of that and opted into the 14-day quarantine upon the return to back home. This is a picture taken from a drone that shows our containment efforts were successful. I'm grateful that the Helsik assisted with the site area for the 3.5 days, and seeing them go hit home for me because they recognize the impact this has on our hearts. The land and resources are a part of who we are. The impact on our resources was real in the moment. The Beacon Estuary is within 200 meters of the impact site and a half a kilometer from the mouth of the Wannock. The Wannock Estuary is home to several species of waterfowl throughout the year as well. There is a large tract of eelgrass that is used by the 5 species of salmon as they climatize to the change in water temperature, going from freshwater to saltwater and vice versa. This is where they hold before heading out into the open ocean and when they return back to the Wannock. Another concern was the Wannock is a tidal river and reaches about 1.5 kilometers upriver and is around the area where the Chinook spawn. In the photo, I'm holding the largest male Chinook that was caught this year to contribute to the Percy Walker's hatchery for the 2021 Chinook egg take. The egg take crew are well aware that the Chinook are a staple for our winter food source and deliver the Chinook to the community. The last area of impact that was a concern was the southern shore at the mouth of the Wannock. This is a harvesting area for the Dungeness crab for our village. We put in place a voluntary closure until the sediment sample came back. They came back with an all clear. That was a weightlifting moment off our shoulders. Next slide, Steve. We had an emergency management crew from the environment sector of EMPC come into the village to assist with the structure setup of the ICS, and we followed those protocols on form reporting. We were also on calls with the federal government, and they did 2 flyovers, and they estimated with the photos they had taken, it was 600 to 800 liters that entered into the represented area and dispersed into the inlet, and no traces into either estuary or into the Wannock. Beacon Nation hired GHD to do water and sediment sampling along with land support of process for land containment of the contaminants. On the land contaminant, a catch trench was dug to help with containment. I walked the shoreline with GHD during low tide to look at any signs of contamination. There was one small trace amount in the upper area of the Wannock estuary, however, so minor it wasn't of a huge concern. It has taken several months and is a slow moving wheel when we deal with Indigenous Services Canada. We had to have 3 contract bids, remediations, and we are finally nearing the removal stage of transporting the contaminated soil off-site. Over the past 2.5 years, we have developed our territorial response plan and our geographic response strategies that are both near completion and are for the protection of our key harvesting areas as well as protection of our cultural features. In closing, I'd like to add that the values of the WECANO is to ensure the protection of our land and waters for today and future generations, and has been since time immemorial. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Steve.
Lena. As you heard in this case study, we are making progress. We're creating a community of practice among First Nation communities. We continue to support significant training opportunities like ICS, SCAT, oil safety, oil spill safety, aerial observation, GRS, geographic response strategy, techniques and tactics. And this is how we're able to see nations support each other even during a pandemic when other agencies aren't available. With the work going on across the 13 communities, we have developed over 250 geographic response strategies. And though in this case, there wasn't a GRS that existed for that site, the Health Guardians, who were a little bit further along in their planning and their processes, were able to transfer their knowledge to Lena and come up with on-the-fly booming strategies. We're beginning to look at things like mutual aid agreements between the nations. We were working with Canada and BC on a regional incident response framework. And once that's done, we'll be moving into sub-regional geographic response plans. This case also highlights many of the challenges and gaps that we've been facing all across the aspects of this work. There's simply not enough equipment available to First Nations. In this case, because the nation was also the polluter, they were on the hook to pay out of pocket for the response, and it was cost prohibitive to hire West Coast Marine Response, who typically either comes from Prince Rupert, quite a ways up north, or from Vancouver, quite a ways down south. The Health Guardians were able to transport equipment into Wichino. If they hadn't been available or willing in the case of COVID and the risks that go along with that, we're not sure what Wichino's options would have been. Because it was a land-based spill, Coast Guard was not able to respond. It's outside their mandate, and so they can't be compensated. They were able to provide or locate some boom that Helsik was able to deliver, which is great. The compensation regime, it's only available for cost recovery, and there's no real-time funding available for response, which really hinders the overall environmental protection, particularly in smaller spills like this. The fund doesn't cover the types of losses that are most important to First Nations, like food harvesting, community impacts, and any other type of loss that's non-economic. Wichino is way off the road system. It doesn't have a grocery store. And basically, what do you do if you can't go fishing for your food? So Wichino has also been at the table with the federal government and the province for several years, and there's still some pretty big holes in the response process. Field personnel aren't necessarily always on the same page with nations about collaborations, and there's been ongoing notification issues across the region. Finally, I guess Canada and BC lack a framework for impact assessment following a spill. It needs to be developed and it needs to be inclusive of First Nations concerns and values. I guess in closing, this is a big and beautiful coast, but even more, it sustains the coastal First Nations communities. There have been dozens of incidents since we started this work, and we need to move beyond the status quo. First Nations have a huge stake in protecting their territories. They have the knowledge of the areas. And they have experience in the water. They're critical to the overall response preparedness regime. The old way was for spill response to push First Nations aside. We just can't afford to do that anymore. They're there before, during, and after these incidents. And we're proud of the community of practice that has been building amongst our group, but there's still a long way to go. Once travel restrictions open up, we're hoping to host an Indigenous learning exchange to build mutual support and share experiences. So I'd like to thank I'd like to thank Lena Collins for her presentation, and Elise DeCola from Nuka Research for supporting all this work. And we'll wrap it up there and take any questions.
I think we're going to ask Elena, Elise, to moderate questions, but we have one in so far, so perhaps I'll read that out to you guys. How are you managing sites of significance in cultural areas that are potentially impacted by spills?
Do you want to take that, Elena?
Yes. At present time, we had done GRS surveys, and our guardians are near completion. We had, I believe it was roughly around 35 to 40 GRS site locations that were identified by members within our community, and our guardian watchmen have gone out to do the assessment of what type of practice would be needed in the event of a spill in the protection of the harvest site or the cultural feature. And that will be finalized by the end of this year. All those sites will be identified and protected.
Great.
And the other part of that, though, too, is that recognizing the value of that is having Coast Guard and other responding agencies have that as a part of their tool, but also knowing that it is a confidential document that they obtain, and that it is only for the use of the incident or during a practice.
Great, thank you, Lena. We do have a few requests that have come in for contact information from you guys. So I put a note in the chat for you to share out your email addresses if you're okay with that to the audience. There are a few folks who'd like to follow up with you. And there's a message from Carlene just wanting to know more about how you were able to bring the 13 First Nations together to work on this. So actually one more question just popped in. This is from Megan Matheson. Can you talk more about the cost losses that are most important to First Nations that are not addressed by the SOPF? Any thoughts on how to tabulate / monetize / submit those kinds of costs?
For costs and losses, especially when it comes to our nations along the coast, it is a clam bed. And if we cannot no longer access that site area, that impacts on our food harvest, and the cost of increases for us to have to obtain groceries from the grocery store. And for us, the limiting factor also, as known on many reserves across Canada and the United States, is employment. And so that is also impacting us in that aspect. So if we lose an area of a harvest area, that is really detrimental to the health of our community.
Excellent, thank you. I don't see any additional questions at this time. So I think with that, we'll wrap up this session. And thank you both, Lena and Steve, for fabulous presentations. I'll get my video going here again.
Thank you.
We are, again, we'd love to share contact information and hopefully your presentations, if that's okay, with the audience after the event. You had some great information in there that others may be interested in seeing and sharing. So with that, we're almost at break time. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Go take a stretch, take a walk, get away from the computer screen, and we'll reconvene at we'll reconvene at 2:35 as listed on the agenda. I'm giving you a few extra minutes to stretch and take a break. So come back at 2:35 and we'll dive into our climate change session.